Last but not least, Mr. Scudamore, known as Scuds, a tall, aging man of upright stature, taught woodwork, and when I first joined the school, he took my form for physical training. He was the only member of the teaching staff not to have a university degree or academic gown, and he spoke with a pronounced Sussex accent. He saw it as his mission to propagate yoga during physical training periods, and used to keep us standing about for ages in the changing rooms, while he told us of his experiences in India, where he had evidently spent part of his life. Another hobby horse of his was chess, and how this game taught young people to develop their powers of concentration and judgment. I joined the chess club, which met once a week in the school library. Now I have introduced those who inherited from Joffrey Loopstra the disconcerting task of putting me through my schooling. I should like to revert to the broader aspects of my new environment in Worthing. As I made new friends at school, I found myself being invited to birthday parties and other social gatherings of youngsters, and I soon overcame my feeling of linguistic inadequacy in fending for myself in English. Probably one of the last instances of my foreign background surfacing was when a new boy who had arrived straight from the Canary Islands joined my form. His name was Peter Wharton, and his linguistic past was as Spanish as mine was Dutch. It was almost certainly because we felt we were slightly different from the natives that we struck up a close friendship and frequently visited one another's homes. Peter lived with two of his aunts who had come to Worthing from Argentina, while his father lived elsewhere with his mother and younger sister. In early 1938, Peter left Worthing to go to a boarding school at Bembridge on the Isle of Wight, but we remained in contact by correspondence until we both joined the forces in 1942. Gerald Granger, who also attended the high school, was one of my first close friends in Worthing. He had an elder brother named Pat, as well as a baby sister called Dawn. Pat and Gerald both sang in a high church choir in West Worthing, and one day they suggested I accompany them. They had told me that choir boys got paid for their services, so I decided I might as well give it a try, even though I was unable to read music. I attended several choir practices as well as a few religious services, in the hope of learning the music by heart, but I found it too complicated. The choirmaster never seemed particularly interested in my presence, and when at the end of the month I was not among the recipients of monetary reward, I took the hint and concluded the church choir was not really my scene. Much as I enjoyed Gerald's cheerful company, I was more relieved than disappointed over abandoning my choir singing venture. There was something about being inside a church that gave me a compulsive urge to get out into the fresh air. The dark, cold, damp atmosphere, the oppressive silence observed, even by those not actually engaged in organized devotion, and the seemingly contrived, obsessive nature of the liturgy all combined to alienate me. I was unable to comprehend how the church could possibly be seen as the guardian of morality and the hope of salvation. Sometimes I wondered whether I ought to have a troubled conscience over my failure to recognize what those around me accepted as unquestionable, and indeed whether I might one day suffer dire consequences for failing to follow obediently the established creed. At the same time, I could not help but wonder whether those who described themselves as the faithful really did have the ability to communicate with their Creator by mumbling prayers and begging for personal favors in church. Did my inability to participate in this lugubrious ritual perhaps point to some kind of spiritual abnormality? Or was attending church and praying merely a habit, passed on from generation to generation, by those anxious to maintain a respectable image in a society where the observance of religious discipline was taken to be an integral part of virtuous living? As I walked home along Broadwater Road from my final choir practice, I was turning these questions over in my mind when I suddenly became aware of an enormous object in the sky over West Worthing. The sheer size of it made me miss a heartbeat. I soon realized it was a German Zeppelin, cruising slowly along our south coast on a spying mission, according to our newspapers the following day. It was thought to be photographing our coastal defences, or rather our landing beaches, as we had no coastal defences yet. It was a beautifully clear evening, and as the mighty airship gently glided past Worthing, I was clearly able to discern the windows in the cabin below its huge silver-grey hull, and the ominous German swastika on its tail fin. When it had disappeared from view, I resumed my walk home, reflecting as I went on my attitude towards religion. As if shaken out of my spiritual disarray by the man-made colossus I had just beheld in the heavens, traditionally the preserve of divine apparitions, I decided I must there and then work out, on the basis of the means at my disposal, where I stood vis-à-vis God and the Church. To be truthful, I had to admit I had no concept of how to communicate with God the Creator, and I had no affection for or understanding of the Church. This was my considered standpoint, and I was going to have to live with it. Once we had settled in, a number of friends and relatives came to visit us in Worthing, to see how we were getting on in our new habitat. My grandma Ems, who was crippled with arthritis, also came to stay, together with her daughter Mabel. When Rose Penley knocked at our door one morning while Grandma was still in bed, her curiosity got the better of her, and in her nightie she warily negotiated a couple of stairs and bent over the banister to see who had entered the living room. In so doing, she lost her balance and hurtled down the rest of the staircase out of control, leaping over several stairs at a time and landing in a neat, motionless little heap in the hall. I witnessed this whole performance and curled up in a fit of uncontrollable laughter, to the anger of my mother and Mabel, who feared Grandma might have done herself a grievous mischief. An opened bottle of brandy wafted gently under her nostrils quickly caused her eyelids to pop open, and no sooner was she helped to her feet than she hobbled off into the kitchen to get herself a glass. During the summer of 1936, I made friends with a high school boy named Jim Swingler, who lived diagonally opposite us at number 87. Jim's mother had also been widowed, and he had a very attractive elder sister named Doreen, who attended the girls' high school. Jim and I often went for walks on the downs behind Worthing, as far as the Stone Age fortress known as Sisbury Ring and the picturesque clump of trees called Chanctonbury Ring. It was along the paths leading up to the downs that we discovered a vine-like creeper that grew prolifically among the trees and shrubs which, when ignited, would smoulder and give off a steady flow of heavy blue-grey smoke. By cutting our creeper into cigarette-like lengths, we found we were able to imbibe the smoke from the glowing end by drawing it through the stem, as was done when smoking cigarettes. We devised the name gaff by inverting the letters in fag to describe our discovery. We collected a stock of these gaffs, which we used to smoke in the shed at the bottom of our garden. During the warmer months of the year, that garden shed was an ideal refuge, to which I withdrew to get out of my mother's way. It didn't need to be kept clean, and there I was able to entertain friends with dirty shoes. It had a small window and, apart from our garden tools, it contained an old unwanted table, a chair, and one or two battered suitcases, as well as a very dusty old trunk. Inside this trunk I found negatives of photographs and German banknotes from the post-war period, overprinted with their grotesquely inflated values of millions of Reichsmarks. I also discovered a set of 2 paperbacks entitled Hugo's Spanish in 3 Months, which had belonged to my father. The shed was the repository for all the junk that my mother had not had the heart to throw into the dustbin. When my mother presented me with a bicycle in early 1937, Jim and I extended our area of operations to take in Shoreham Airport, where we used to watch light aircraft, mostly Tiger Moths, take off and land. There was a regular passenger service between Shoreham and the Channel Islands, operated by de Havilland Dragonfly biplanes. We occasionally even caught a 31 bus or train to go ice skating at the indoor stadium in Brighton. It must have been in late 1937, while on my way through the graveyard around Broadwater Church to join my mother at the bus stop, that I met my Waterloo and suffered an even more ignominious humiliation than Napoleon did in 1815. I was walking along the top of a low wall that separated the actual graveyard from the pathway running through it, when I noticed a small boy coming towards me, along the same low wall. The small boy was accompanied by a much bigger, uncouth-looking boy, who truculently ordered me to get out of his little companion's way. When I refused, he challenged me to a fight. He took off his jacket and drove his fist into my face with such force that I was knocked off my feet. He then jumped onto me and pinned me down. At that moment, my mother, who had seen me knocked down, came rushing up from the bus stop and sternly ordered my assailant to release me and remove himself from the scene, which he did, I do not think Napoleon could ever have felt more ashamed and demeaned than I did, as my mother led me to the bus stop with a huge black eye slowly burgeoning into full blossom. Following the Anschluss, Germany's annexation of Austria, in March 1938, the stream of Jewish refugees fleeing from Nazi persecution soared. Many sought sanctuary in Britain, and local welfare organizations appealed to families to offer shelter to fugitives without adequate means. One of my mother's friends prevailed upon her to volunteer to take such a refugee aboard at 82 Shandon Road. It thus came to pass that one day in late 1938, a very large, fat, boorish young Viennese Jew named Erwin Spitzer arrived to join our household. We found it hard to believe his claim that he was aged only 15. So did our bus conductors when he demanded a child's half-fare ticket. His table manners were appalling, his appetite insatiable, and every evening after supper he helped himself to a hat belonging to my mother, she was our only hat owner, before disappearing into the loo, where he remained for about an hour, allegedly saying his prayers with his head appropriately covered, as prescribed by Jewish custom. I do not recall how my mother eventually got rid of him, but we were mighty glad when he departed. The Anschluss was followed some 6 months later by the Munich Agreement, whereby Britain and France did a deal with Nazi Germany, allowing the latter to annex the Sudetenland, the border areas of Czechoslovakia, in exchange for a pledge that Germany harboured no further territorial aspirations. Then, in March 1939, the Nazis occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, in violation of their Munich undertaking, and it became clear to even the most naive onlooker that Herr Hitler and his Italian mucker, Signor Mussolini, who had meanwhile invaded Abyssinia, were to be regarded as very much more sinister than just a couple of comic opera stooges, as our newspaper cartoonists liked portraying them. That we should be in danger of becoming embroiled in a new global war seemed a bit far-fetched. Yet, on sober reflection, something intensely disturbing and frightening seemed to be in the melting pot of international politics. Not only were Germany and Italy quite openly challenging the existing geographical order, under which Britain, France, and one or two junior partners had much of the world divided up between them as colonies. In the background, another contender for world domination, Soviet Russia, was quietly but purposefully intriguing against the established order, on the pretext of aiming to unite the workers of the world under communism. One day, a representative of the Hitler Youth, dressed in khaki shorts, an open-necked khaki shirt, and flaunting a red and black swastika armband, was allowed to address our school assembly. He informed us in vehement, gutturally distorted English of the happy, friendly, constructive atmosphere in Nazi Germany, where the much-loved Führer was striving to right some of the injustices inflicted upon the Reich at Versailles after the 1914-18 war. He concluded his address by clicking his heels together, and with outstretched arm shouting Heil Hitler, thereby totally demolishing anything he might otherwise have achieved in promoting the Nazi cause. Afterwards, one of my form mates advanced the view that, ridiculous as fascism and Nazism were, if it ever came to the crunch, he'd rather live under such a regime than under the wretchedness of communism. For some reason, our German teacher, Anderson, was temporarily transferred to duties elsewhere. During his absence, his place was taken by a pale, shy, self-conscious man named Corbett, who devoted much of our German periods to extolling the virtues of Nazi Germany, where he had seen political and economic chaos make way for law and order, material progress and patriotism. In early 1939, a chap in my form named Martin, no relation to the Beak, and I decided to find out more about the profiles of the political baddies in our midst by taking a first-hand look at the local Worthing branches of the British Union of Fascists, BAF, and the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB. We called first at a shop near the town centre which served as the district headquarters of Sir Oswald Mosley's BAF, where we were given an affable welcome. We found the party faithful lounging about in a relaxed mood, quenching their thirst and sneering over the ineptitude of our national political leaders in managing Britain's role in the world. While our country was absorbing an ever-increasing stream of refugees, they lamented, no one had as much as batted an eyelid when a British woman was sexually assaulted by natives in China. Where were our gunboats? They demanded. A British government worthy of the name should see to it that whenever a British subject was insulted or harmed, a few shells be fired in the direction of the perpetrators, to teach them to respect and fear Britain's might. Hitler and Musso were only doing in Germany and Italy what we should be doing in defence of Britain's interests. Communist Russia, they claimed, was run by a gang of Jews. Most of the members of the Soviet Politburo either had Jewish blood in their veins or they were married to Jewesses. Among the 20-odd party members we saw, there was one who had the appearance of a gentleman farmer. He was ruggedly but stylishly attired, and spoke to the others as I imagined a country squire might address his labourers. He ordered one of his henchmen to look after us, as we showed promise as potential future members, and he handed us some copies of the Buff newspaper action, which he felt sure we would find well worth reading. He also gave us wads of propaganda leaflets, which he asked us to pop into letterboxes in our respective neighbourhoods. In contrast to the pub-like atmosphere at the BUF, the local chapter of the CPGB gathered in what looked like a Methodist church hall. We were politely invited to take our places in the neatly set-out rows of chairs facing the local party secretary, who was seated at a table working on his papers. In the corner beside the secretary, a lectern had been set up. The hall was adorned with red flags, pictures of Marx, Lenin and Stalin, and a huge banner bearing the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." Martin and I sat down among the 20 or 30 party faithful and waited, poker-faced. Eventually the secretary called the meeting to order by inviting the assembled comrades to stand up and sing a communist hymn, the words of which the congregation knew by heart. We then resumed our seats to hear the secretary talk about current local party activities. This was followed by the singing of another red hymn, and then the volunteer of the week was invited to take his place at the lectern and present his painstakingly prepared summary of the past week's political events, as reported and commented in the Daily Worker. One of the subjects dealt with was the use by the Italian army of vicious dum-dum bullets against innocent victims in Abyssinia. Another was the Soviet bone of contention that Moscow was being slighted by the Western world's governments, in that they invariably only sent minor officials to discuss with top Soviet leaders such burning issues as measures needed to contain fascist expansion. When he had finished, he was applauded, and the secretary commented on the points he had raised. Questions were then invited from the auditorium and answered with dogmatic expertise. After the singing of their Internationale, tea and biscuits were served and the meeting disbanded. No one showed any interest in us, and we were given no leaflets to distribute. Following our brief exploratory calls on the local centres of extreme left and right-wing political persuasion, Martin and I concluded that, unlike the fascists, the drab, classless, humourless communists had appeared impressively well organised, and they had conducted the meeting we attended in a purposeful and businesslike manner. For all their relaxed, affable bonhomie, the fascists had projected an image of a superficial and gullible, jeering and scoffing rabble, officered by the gentleman farmer, or whatever he really was, whose innate superior bearing and command of English made him stand out above his rank-and-file underlings. For a while I kept as souvenirs the BF newspapers and leaflets he gave me, but later, during the war, consigned them to the dustbin for fear of their somehow being discovered and handed to the police, which might have led to my arrest and detention under Emergency Law 18B. Both the BUF and the CPGB demanded from their followers mental acrobatics, which precluded open-minded thought and personal independent judgment. Party dogma had to be accepted and inwardly digested without question, in much the same way as demanded by the world's main religious faiths. The BF's obsession with British superiority seemed not only ridiculous, but also self-defeating, and despite my antipathy towards Erwin Spitzer, there seemed to be no logical reason, let alone the slightest justification, for nurturing hatred towards the entire Jewish race. The communists, for their part, also fostered emotive prejudice in putting across their message. Besides lashing out at their natural enemies, the fascists, they directed much unreasoned venom at the existing establishment and economic order, and with their slogans, hymns, and half-truths, they were clearly manipulating their followers. Probably because I had been spared religious indoctrination and had spent the earlier part of my childhood in Holland among people with different traditions and customs, I intuitively repudiated blind prejudice and intolerance, whether it was motivated by patriotism, religious conviction, or political ideology. During the early months of 1939, the British government, as if at last aroused from its make-believe dream of peace in our time, was finally seen to be reacting tangibly to Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia and to Hitler's bellicose tirades against decadent British plutocrats in the service of international Jewry. Every citizen of the United Kingdom was issued with a gas mask, and air raid wardens were appointed to deal with the enforcement of blackout arrangements and other problems, which were likely to arise in the event of enemy air raids. I was one of many who thought that these measures were merely intended as a clear, demonstrative warning to Hitler not to engage in further military operations against his neighbours. Surely the Germans didn't seriously want a war any more than we did? In order to get a bit of extra German language practice, I decided in April 1939 to write to my childhood playmate, Gunther Eisenbeck, in the Van Diepenburgstraat in The Hague, suggesting we start corresponding in both English and German, and correcting one another's mistakes in the process. Gunther enthusiastically agreed to my proposal. In his letters he seemed obsessed with finding out about Germany's reputation abroad and any fear the Nazis might be generating of a new major war. In a letter dated the 8th of August, 1939, some 3 weeks before the outbreak of the Second World War, he advanced the view that in Germany there was hardly any fear of another war, since the Germans knew that Adolf Hitler would never allow things to go that far. But, he went on, if a war could not be avoided, Germany could depend on her most modern defences, in the West as well as in the East. In spite of the tense and precarious international situation, previously made arrangements went ahead, whereby Gerald Granger and I were to spend our 1939 summer holidays at one another's homes. On the 30th of July, I set off by Southern Electric for London's Victoria Station, where I crossed the road to the coach station and boarded a Scottish motor traction (SMT) coach for the 15-hour drive to Edinburgh. While in the London area, I noticed a number of barrage balloons in the sky. They were attached to the ground by cable and were designed to prevent enemy dive bombers from attacking their targets. At Edinburgh, I was met by Mrs. Granger and Gerald and driven to their detached house on the city's outskirts. During my 2.5-week stay, I was shown the sights: Edinburgh Castle, Princes Street, the Royal Mile, Holyrood Palace, the Scottish National War Memorial, the Forth Bridge and the Zoo, and Gerald took me swimming at the impressive Portobello Stadium. I loved Edinburgh, especially Princes Street, with its elegant shops along one side, facing the spectacular castle atop its mighty rock, high above the trees obscuring the main LNER railway line. On the 16th of August, Mr. and Mrs. Granger, Gerald and I crammed into the Grangers' small family car for the drive to Worthing. After crossing the Cheviot Hills and Northumberland along country roads running through mainly bare, hilly pastureland, with stone walls separating the fields, we joined the A1 trunk road for the major part of the journey south. In Worthing, Gerald's parents bade us farewell and drove off to stay with friends of theirs. During his stay with us, I took Gerald for walks on the downs, swimming off our stony beaches, and to watch films at our local cinemas. On the morning of the 3rd of September, a couple of days before he was due to return home, we went swimming at Splash Point. It was a sunny but windy day, and I cycled home to fetch a towel we'd forgotten, leaving Gerald to amuse himself on the beach. At home, I found my mother looking rather sombre. She told me I'd better go back and bring Gerald home at once. At 11 o'clock, the Prime Minister was due to make an important statement on the radio, in which he was expected to announce Britain's response to Hitler's brutal invasion of Poland. I raced down to the beach to fetch Gerald. Once back home, we all gathered round the radio set and tensely waited for the clock to strike 11. We then heard Mr. Chamberlain make his historic speech announcing that we now found ourselves in a state of war with Nazi Germany. The speech was followed by martial music. We looked at one another, wondering what effect this was going to have on our lives. After 3 minutes, we were horror-stricken to hear the wailing of our air raid sirens. "There you are," said my mother. "The German Air Force will have been circling round our coasts, awaiting our declaration of war. Now they will be flying in to drop poison gas over us." We rushed for our gas masks. Gerald had not brought his with him. We then began arguing over who was to give his mask to Gerald. My mother insisted he take hers, while Bobby and I wanted him to have ours. Gerald himself was embarrassed over the schmozzle his oversight was occasioning, and insisted he bear the consequences himself. Our discussion was soon interrupted by the renewed sound of the sirens, this time announcing the all clear. We heard later that the alarm had been set off by a passing seagull being mistaken for an enemy bomber. There were no further alerts during the remainder of Gerald's stay, and he returned home safely to Edinburgh to be happily reunited with his gas mask. So the unthinkable, which had suddenly become the inevitable, had now actually come to pass. Britain and France had honoured their commitment to go to Poland's assistance in the event of her being attacked, and we were now both at war against the aggressor. Whether we would in fact have the ability to assist Poland was another matter. For the first time I was able to turn a blind eye to cricket, fox hunting, the Church of England, perverse arithmetical and spelling customs, the wearisome class system, and I experienced a feeling of patriotic pride in being British. I also felt respect and admiration for the French, to whom I had hitherto never really given very much thought. In the early days of the war, we all waited with bated breath, wondering what was going to happen. Surely it couldn't last for long. It did occur to me that, should it by any chance go on for as long as 2 or 3 years, I'd be old enough to be called up for military service. But that seemed most unlikely. Modern military weapons, especially modern aircraft, were so devastating in their destructive power that warring nations would not be able to keep hostilities going for any length of time. The immediate question, as I saw it, was this: was Germany powerful enough to overrun the Maginot Line and take on the combined British and French armies? Or, alternatively, were the Allies in a position to launch an attack on Germany? Such were the idle thoughts of a schoolboy observer contemplating the military scene. I was in for some startling surprises. The news from Poland was heartbreaking. The Germans just blasted their way forward, crushing with their vastly superior military machine everything that stood in their way. In the midst of Poland's desperate struggle against the Nazi invaders came the horrifying news of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, enabling the Red Army to march into Poland from the east. The formerly irreconcilable arch-enemies thus carved up between them their doomed, helpless victim. While our Polish allies were being ruthlessly wiped off the map, there was ghostly inactivity along Germany's border with France. It seemed neither the Germans nor the Allies felt ready to embark upon the decisive battle. At home, the first indication of a change from peacetime normality was the scrapping by the BBC of its regular programmes, which were replaced by non-stop popular music, interrupted only by frequent news bulletins and official announcements. A Ministry of Information was set up to counter Dr. Goebbels's propaganda apparatus. Our media were soon matching the Germans in the fierceness of their invective. Dear old Mrs. Penley, our neighbour, was a good barometer in assessing the effectiveness of our new information ministry. Shortly before the outbreak of war, she told me the majority of Germans were decent people, only their leaders were wicked. A week or so into the war, she declared that the only good German was a dead one. The BBC was, of course, continually reminding us of the need for strict adherence to total blackout during the hours of darkness, and ARP, Air Raid Precautions wardens, patrolled the streets at night to make sure no light was visible. When school resumed at the start of the 1939 autumn term, it was business as usual. The Polish tragedy was over, and apart from the odd skirmish at sea and in the air, the warring nations confined themselves to hissing polemics at one another, and preparing for the momentous battles that inevitably lay ahead. Ever since our move to England, my mother had managed our financial affairs with seemingly miraculous expertise. She kept us properly fed and clothed on the proceeds from having a paying guest occupy part of our house. My main contribution to routine domestic chores consisted of looking after the garden, mowing the lawn, cutting the hedge and the unwelcome task of weeding, fetching in the coke, doing the drying after my mother had washed up, helping with the shopping, and keeping my room tidy. Needless to say, the wild enthusiasm with which I accomplished these tasks varied from plain zero to a grudging acceptance that I couldn't very well expect my mother to do everything. in view of the financial constraints fate had placed upon us. It is hardly surprising that I viewed with interest any monetarily rewarding activities in which my peers were engaged. My own first gainful activity was to deliver vegetables to customers' homes on behalf of a shop in Montague Street, but this was just a Christmas job. I then began scouting around for vacancies for paper boys and eventually got fixed up with a newsagent's on Upper Brighton Road named Dodds, still known by the former owner's name of Sparks. The two Lancashire ladies who ran the shop seemed to take a liking to me and gave me 2 early morning rounds. My urban round involved delivering to houses along the length of nearby Hadley Avenue, on completion of which I set out on my rural round, which took in a large area centred on the village of Sompting. It was certainly a healthy job, and it provided me with the princely sum of 6 shillings a week, placing me in the upper income bracket among paper boys. While sitting in our garden shed one day in early 1940, I decided to look through the old Spanish textbooks which had belonged to my father. I discovered many similarities between Spanish and French in both the vocabulary and the grammar. The book's publishers, Hugo's, claimed their course could be completed in 3 months, which happened to be roughly the period I had left to prepare for the school certificate. Motivated partly by the wish to finish something my father had begun, and partly by an urge to put one over on my school, I decided to have a bash at Hugo's Spanish. I set about it with grim determination and methodically cut myself off from the world at large by locking myself into my bedroom and working until late into the night. As I progressed, my enthusiasm intensified. With some 6 weeks to go to the school certificate, I sought an interview with the Beak to ask him whether I could take Spanish as one of my subjects. Lying through my teeth, I assured him I had a good command of the language, having had Spanish-speaking friends in my early youth. Although no one on the school staff was able to test my claim, he undertook to apply to Cambridge for a set of Spanish papers for me to be sent to the school at the appropriate time. Having thus achieved what I wanted, I now needed to redouble my efforts to get my Spanish up to the standard of my French and German, which I did at the expense of preparing for the other subjects in which I was to be examined. During my final year at school, I was one of a group of 4 upper 5 B.ers calling themselves the League Unanimous, which pretended to be a kind of closed brotherhood of friends, who, however, never did anything more enterprising or conspiratorial than to stick together at school. The members of our league were Mike Terry, symbol Lew1, an exceptionally eloquent boy who planned to take up journalism, myself as Lew2, Ikey Thompson, Lew3, and Len Upfield, who was Lew4. I frequently visited Mike at his home in Coombe Rise in Findon, from where we used to take his red setter Thor for walks on nearby Sisbury Ring. Throughout the winter of 1939-1940, it seemed as though the war against Germany was never really going to get off the ground. In Britain we looked on aghast as the vast Soviet Union, at the time its population totalled some 180 million, attacked Finland, population 4 million. Under the military leadership of Marshal Mannerheim, the Finns resisted valiantly, but after 3 months of bitter fighting, they had to yield to the numerical superiority of the invader and cede important parts of their territory. Then, on the 9th of April 1940, our war hotted up as Nazi Germany wantonly overran Denmark, where there was virtually no resistance, and simultaneously set about attacking Norway. Despite attempts by our Royal Navy and French forces to establish a beachhead at Narvik, the Germans managed to subdue Norway in the space of 2 or 3 weeks. The Nazis pretended to justify their actions by claiming that Norway had been allowing Allied ships to take refuge in its fjords and coastal waters, and they needed to forestall likely Allied plans to use Denmark and Norway as bases for attacks on Germany itself. I found the whole operation, let alone the pretext, somewhat illogical. Surely it seemed to me they would have done themselves more good by launching a direct attack on French or British territory, rather than expending military effort on occupying hitherto neutral countries. Of course, had I been aware of Hitler's plans, or the full extent of Germany's military strength, I might have understood what was going on. The big shock came about a month after the attacks on Denmark and Norway. On the 10th of May 1940, the Nazis hurled the full force of their military might at Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. On my way home from school that day, I called at 10 Shandon Road to hear the latest developments from Nellie and Dora Thompson, who were glued to their radio, listening to the catastrophic news from Holland. Endless columns of enemy tanks and armour were pouring across the Dutch borders. Large contingents of German paratroops were being dropped at strategic points behind the Dutch army's lines, and Rotterdam was under ferocious attack by Stuka dive bombers. The Dutch army hadn't a hope in hell of resisting this devastating onslaught. My thoughts went out to my early childhood friends in the Van Diepenburgstraat. At home, I tuned in to the Dutch radio station in Hilversum. Although I hadn't spoken Dutch for years, I was still able to understand it perfectly. In Britain, Mr. Chamberlain made way for the old warmonger Winston Churchill, who had for years been urging tough action against Hitler. Paul Reynaud became the new Prime Minister of France, but our new leaders could do nothing to halt the German offensive. Holland fell within just 5 days. Belgium followed 17 days later. By then, German forces had bypassed the Maginot Line by smashing their way forward into France from the north. Our own British Expeditionary Force in France was ordered to abandon the sinking ship and did what it could to get back to the United Kingdom from the beaches around Dunkirk. On the 10th of June, having satisfied himself that the risk was worth taking, Mussolini declared Italy to be at war with France and Britain. To put it mildly, our military position didn't look at all too reassuring. The day after Mussolini's momentous decision to declare war on us, I reached the age of precisely 16 and a half. While out walking on my own on the Downs, it occurred to me that I should mark the occasion by recording the events that lay ahead in diary form, a bit à la Samuel Pepys. A more opportune moment to embark on such a venture was unlikely to present itself. I bought myself a foolscap-sized memoranda or minute book, and on the inside front cover, under my name, address and recent photograph, I wrote the following foreword: Tuesday, November 6th, 40. It is only quite recently that the idea of keeping a diary came into my head, probably because life is becoming ever more eventful, and also because I have reached the age of leaving school and finding a job. Today I am just 16 and a half years old, at 11 a.m., so I consider it quite an opportune moment to start. Moreover, the war is getting ever more desperate, and we are expecting to see some of it over here before long. All these things ought to provide me with ample material for writing, so I wish myself the best of luck with the diary, and I hope I shall have enough perseverance to keep it up. My record of that same day's events certainly illustrated what turbulent and dramatic times we were going through. I began by reporting, "The political situation very grave. Yesterday at about 6 p.m, Mussolini declared Italy to be at war with the Allies. King Haakon of Norway and his government arrived in London. Paul Reynaud is visiting the front. The French government has left Paris. So has the Bourse. Germans reported to have crossed the Seine at Rouen. All Allied troops were yesterday withdrawn from northern Norway." At midnight, President Roosevelt made one of his pretty speeches. He also sent us prayers, bless his little heart. I went on to mention that although it was half-term, we had been required to attend school for half the day, either to play cricket or to be taken on a supervised walk. This was to prevent boys from lurking around the seafront and other military places. In the evening I went for a walk on the Downs with a Slovak political refugee from Bratislava named Riesenbach, who had been billeted next door to the Thompsons. On the 12th of June I reported that the RAF and the South African Air Force had carried out raids on northern Italy and on Italian air bases in Libya, Abyssinia, Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. The Italians, for their part, had carried out several raids on Malta, but had caused little damage. Italian ships all over the world had been seized or scuttled. On the 13th of June, I noted the Germans had advanced to within 16 miles of Paris. 6,000 British soldiers had been taken prisoner of war. And then, on the 14th of June, I recorded the sickening news that ever since 7 a.m, German forces have been entering Paris. French troops had withdrawn to positions behind the capital to save it from destruction. The French government had moved to Tours. All essential services, including the police and fire brigades, had remained in Paris and laid down their arms. In agreement with the French government, Spanish troops had occupied the international zone in Tangiers. On the 17th of June came the dramatic and heartbreaking news that France had surrendered. Paul Reynaud and his government resigned, and Marshal Pétain, who had assumed power, announced in a radio broadcast to the French people that he had contacted the enemy and asked for terms for an armistice. German forces had advanced right up to the Swiss border, thus completely encircling and neutralising France's impregnable Maginot Line. In a BBC broadcast, Churchill expressed his grief for the gallant French people who had fallen into this terrible misfortune. The genius of France, he vowed, would rise again. We had now become the sole champions in arms to defend the world cause. The news of France's surrender absolutely stunned me. The fact that our mighty French ally could be overrun in so short a time sent nervous shivers down my back. I could not comprehend why the French had given up so soon. After all, at the start of the war, the Poles had valiantly fought on to the bitter end. The Germans were now free to concentrate all the fury and might at their disposal on attacking us. Hardly a comforting thought. There was more grim news to report on that fateful the 17th of June 1940. The Soviet Union delivered ultimatums to Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, requiring them to replace their existing governments with administrations sympathetic to the USSR. Soviet military garrisons in these three Baltic states were to be strengthened. I wondered what was the significance of these Soviet moves, coming at precisely this juncture in Nazi Germany's fortunes. Were the Russians digging themselves in, sensing an impending Nazi attack? I jotted down, somewhat prophetically as it eventually turned out, that I considered the USSR, the USA and the British Empire might well one day end up as allies. As ideological arch-enemies of the Nazis, I thought the Russians might even be planning to attack Germany, or if they considered Germany was likely to emerge victorious, they would annex as much territory as possible, such as India, while their non-aggression pact with Germany still appeared valid. In the aftermath of the shattering events of the 17th of June, Hitler and Mussolini met in Munich the following day to discuss the fate of France. Despite France's acknowledged defeat, fighting continued on all fronts, while French politicians, now evacuated to Bordeaux, declared that France would not accept a dishonourable peace. The Germans made angry noises. In the House of Commons, Churchill made one of his many memorable speeches. It was broadcast in the evening by the BBC, the one that ends with the defiant rallying call, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear ourselves that if the British Commonwealth and Empire last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." It was also in the course of this speech that Churchill referred to the proclamation of our willingness to conclude with the French people a union of common citizenship. On the night of 18th/19th June, the Luftwaffe gave us a taste of things to come by carrying out its most extensive bombing of British targets thus far. Of the 100 aircraft used, they lost 7. Simultaneously, RAF bombing raids over Germany were stepped up. Then, on the 19th of June at 11:30 p.m., our air raid sirens in Worthing sounded. My mother woke me, but I declined to follow official advice and go downstairs with her and Bobby. When, a few minutes later, I heard the sound of a distant aircraft engine, I opened my bedroom window and looked out. A dozen or so searchlight beams were converged on a small area in the cloud cover above Goring. What they appeared to be looking for gradually moved to the north towards High Salvington. Then, after sweeping the cloud over Findon, the searchlight beams moved in our direction, and I heard an aircraft engine heading for the English Channel. Once the supposed intruder had disappeared, I went back to bed. In the morning my mother told me the all-clear had sounded at 3:45 a.m. That day there was only one subject of conversation on everyone's lips: last night's alert. Fuller spent the whole of the English period discussing it and the war generally. On tuning in to Radio Luxembourg on the 20th of June, I heard the relay of a broadcast by the German Reichsrundfunk, reporting that Lyons and Brest had fallen, and that in reprisal for the RAF's bombing of civilian targets, the Luftwaffe had carried out raids against Hull and Billingham. During the day, a Ministry of Information leaflet wafted through our letterbox entitled, "If the invader comes, what to do and how to do it." It pointed out that when Holland and Belgium were invaded, the civilian population had fled their homes, crowded onto the roads in cars, in carts, on bicycles and on foot, and so helped the enemy by preventing their own armies from advancing against the invader. "You must not allow this to happen here," it went on. "If the Germans come by parachute, aeroplane or ship, the order is stay put. If the commander-in-chief decides the place where you live must be evacuated, he will tell you when and how to leave. Do not believe or spread rumors. When you receive an order, make sure it is not faked. Most of you know and trust your policemen and your ARP wardens. If you see anything suspicious, note it carefully and report it at once to your nearest police station or military officer. Do not give or tell the Germans anything. Hide your food, bicycles and maps. If you possess a car or motorbicycle, thoroughly immobilize it when not in use and hide all fuel. Be ready to help our military in any way. In factories and shops, a system should be organized now by which a sudden attack can be resisted. Think before you act, but think always of your country before you think of yourself." The German Reichsrundfunk's senior English language broadcaster was widely known in Britain as Lord Haw-Haw. His real name was William Joyce. He regularly read the Nazi version of the news over the senders Hamburg, Bremen and Cologne. He had rather a nauseating, supercilious voice, and it sounded as though his nose was permanently blocked. He would begin each broadcast by haughtily announcing, "Germany calling, Germany calling." He was largely disregarded in Britain, and by those like me who were curious to hear what the enemy had to say. He was viewed with a mixture of faint ridicule and dispassionate contempt. Music hall comedians liked making fun of him. As a Nazi propaganda weapon, he was a complete and abject failure. What I particularly enjoyed about both German and Dutch radio broadcasts was their popular music, which I regarded as far more agreeable to the ear than comparable Anglo-American musical fare from the BBC. On German radio, I heard a report on the 21st of June on the meeting between the German victors and the vanquished French in the famous railway carriage in which the 1918